Peace, family. Y'all know who it is. Bakari Lumumba, the progenitor of LumumbaSpeaks.com, a Black empowerment initiative where we believe we could gain a competitive advantage by always betting on Black. Before we get started, make sure you hit the subscribe and like button and share it to all your friends and well-wishers. So getting started, back with another video. We're launching an unprecedented series, a 3-part series on combating the carceral state. This is part 1. We're going to be discussing historical issue, contemporary problem, right? Combating the carceral state. The reason why I've chosen to use the term carceral state rather than criminal justice system is because I think the carceral state, according to Michel Foucault, who was a French philosopher, really encapsulates the ideology and mindset, not only of the criminal justice system, but of the culture and society that we live in, where there's this concept of panoptic surveillance. And we know that unfortunately Black people, historically, since we were brought here to this country over 400 years ago, we've been under constant surveillance, seen as oftentimes I would call or argue enemies of the state, or as Martin Delaney would state, as denizens and not citizens, right? And so as a result, I think it's very important that we understand when we look at the work of Michelle Alexander and her seminal text, The New Jim Crow, Mass Incarceration in the Age of what? Color Blindness, because we know after Obama was elected, the media ushered in this concept of a post-racial America, right? That race was no longer a problem because we had our first Black president, but the reality of the situation was that was not the case. And of course, we saw a rise in the number of not only white supremacist hate groups, but also in terms of anti-Black violence and anti-Black racism. And I think it's very important that we understand why I'm using the word anti-Black racism as opposed to simply racism, right? Now, first and foremost, when we move forward, we just want to start with some working definitions. We know that racism was rooted in what? The ability to systematically, adversely affect a group of people's lives in a number of different areas of human activity: law, politics, sex, sport, education, entertainment, etc. When we talk about anti-Black racism, we're talking about an antagonistic relationship between Blackness and the possibility of humanity, right? And we see that this is something that takes place globally, not just here in the death and decadence of the Western diaspora, right? But globally, we see anti-Black racism, even in cultures of people of color in Asia, in South America, Native Americans, so on and so forth. So I think it's very important that we understand that we're talking about anti-Black racism when we talk about combating the carceral state. So, number 1, going back to a warrior scholar, Michelle Alexander, and her seminal text, Mass Incarceration in the Age of Color Blindness, she talks about how Black people, particularly here in America, but we can even juxtapose this throughout the world, but we'll keep it to the shores of America for now, how she discusses the fact that in her research, she finds that Black people have been under a system of social control since chattel enslavement, right? And this reminds me of the late, great ancestor, scholar, warrior scholar, sociologist, philosopher, W.E.B. Du Bois, right? When he talked about how we had a brief moment in Jubilee that we gained our freedom, right? It's 1865, we're talking about the Emancipation Proclamation, Juneteenth celebration. And then we had a moment in the sun, Du Bois said. And then we went right back into what? Enslavement. And that enslavement he was talking about was sharecropping. He was talking about, of course, peonage laws. He was talking about what? Convict leasing. He was talking about Black codes, chain gangs, Jim Crow, and of course now, according to Michelle Alexander, the new Jim Crow. And so when we talk about this concept of the carceral state, we're talking about the Black community being under a system of constant surveillance, right? And that the solution to Black existence is what? As Huey Freeman stated on the Boondocks, is what? To lock us up and make sure that we are making money for the prison industrial complex. And so I think it's very important that we understand that the carceral state, when we're talking about combating the carceral state is not only a historical issue, but it's also a contemporary issue, right? Because this goes beyond just the fact that we know that the criminal justice system is inherently racist at every level, local, state, and federal. This goes beyond the fact that we understand that oftentimes Black boys and girls are pushed into disabilities and lower track educational tracks in school. And that, of course, they look at, hey, how many beds are we going to need for those to be incarcerated based off third grade reading scores? But it goes a little deeper than that. It goes to the fact that in this country, according to Samuel Yett in his book, The Choice, The Issue of Black Survival in America, is that we're supposed to either accept our miserable lot in life or die. And so we want to combat that, and we're going to look at some proactive ways of doing that in parts 2 and 3. But I think it's very important that we talk about the carceral state, what this means, what this looks like, that we need to understand that, of course, many of us do, but many of us do not, that the whole concept of police, and particularly in relation to Black people in the South, was rooted in, of course, slave catchers, right? Slave catchers became police officers, and this started the carceral state to where criminality, violence, enslaved became a metonym for what? Big Blackness. And so we want to combat those things. I think, unfortunately, oftentimes we've seen situations in which we almost have embraced these ideas and these concepts of criminality, so on and so forth. I know I had a conversation with a brother the other day, and strong brother about the right things, great father, great husband. But he kind of said, I'm a real N-word, right? And I said, no, you're not. You're a man, right? You're not lazy. You're not indolent. You're not slothful. You're not ignorant, right? You're a productive citizen. So I think oftentimes we have to move away from some of these unfortunate, unhealthy concepts that we have of each other, right? And we know that Dr. Frances Cress Welsing in her seminal text, the ISIS Papers, talks about this, and some of the language that we use when we talk about each other and we refer to ourselves kind of represents a situation in which we have not come into full-grown adulthood. And so we don't want to make sure that we are recycling or regurgitating some of those negative issues that are being projected on society, projected onto us by the dominant society. So, like I said, part 1, unprecedented series. Make sure you subscribe and like. Combating the Carceral State, historical issue, contemporary problem. Look out for part 2, where we're going to be discussing how we got to this situation, right? We understand the history, but we're going to talk about the contemporary issue, particularly how up into the 1960s, the face of criminality in America was white men. We're going to talk about the history of gangsterism and the Al Capones and the Lucky Lucianos and so on and so forth. And that when you look at the penal institutions and the population rates based on race, white men were at the top and Black people were, for the most part, non-existent, and then how that changed in terms of the civil rights and Black power movement. But we're also going to talk about some of the cultural ethos and psychology and values of the Black community. Oftentimes when I talk about some of the issues that we've seen in the Black community, typically why the Black community is in the situation it's in terms of criminality and the level, the numbers of our young men and women that we have in the criminal justice system, as well as when we talk about the breakdown of the Black family, the traditional Black family. I think it's very important that we understand that I believe that this came at the confluence of 3 things. 1, integration. 2, the liberalization of Black community values. And then number 3, we have to understand that this is most important, was the removal of the man from the household, right? So we talk about the liberalization of Black community values, integration, then the removal of the man from the household, unfortunately led to some of the issues that we see today. And I think this is very important. I'm currently reading a biography of W.B. Du Bois, exhaustive text, but it talks about how this was a norm in terms of how Black people thought in the 19th century, in the 20th century. How can we insulate ourselves from some of the vices and the various agents in society, right? And that was to have a strong family structure in which we could lean and depend and rely on each other. So we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about the importance of industry, the role that industry has played. We talk about the systematic exclusion of Black people in particular industries. Even when we talk about the great work of A. Philip Randolph and the Brotherhood of Sigma Car Porters and Maids, which was the first Black union. It took them 12 years to bring that union to fruition. And but the struggle and why Black people are systematically removed from unions and what that did for our ability to have a quality life here in America. But once again, that's going to come up in part 2. But just want to kind of do a brief teaser for part 1 of our unprecedented 3-part series, Combating the Carceral State. This is part 1, as I stated, historical issue, contemporary problem. Appreciate you being here with us. Make sure you hit the subscribe and like button. Until next time, peace.